record right now. And then today's format is going to be a presentation followed by an open question and answer session. If you would like, because we do have you muted to get a good recording, you can submit written questions at any time during the presentation using the chat function, and then we'll answer them at the end. And again, at the end, we can also have you come off mute to ask those. So thank you again for joining us today, and I'll now turn it over to Craig Hayton, our Community Services Director.
Great. Thank you, Shauna. Good afternoon, everybody. As Shauna mentioned, I'm Craig Hayton, Tempe's Community Services Director. I'd like to welcome you and thank you for taking the time either to attend the virtual meeting or after the fact, revisit the recording that we'll have online. It really is important to us that you take the time to review this information. We're going to be seeking feedback on a couple different pieces, and we value your time and your input. And while I will be presenting today, I'm just one person of a multidisciplinary team across the city that's going to be working on this effort and supporting this effort. We certainly will run through kind of what our steps and timeline looks like, but our overall goal for today is to provide, my goal is to provide information both at the virtual meeting and then our first in-person meeting this evening, to provide information and an overview of our process to ensure that you're equipped to provide feedback in a way that really helps make changes and updates to our special events code and then any related elements of our Parks and Recreation Code. So we'll be focused on special events code, what we'll title Section 5.2, and then there may be some ancillary improvements and updates that we'll make for our Parks and Recreation Code. The presentation will include information about that. But I would like to just remind you, please take time to fill out the survey. It is now live. It's going to be open for a month. That is going to be the main way that we're going to be soliciting feedback. We value your questions. Hopefully the questions that we received today during this presentation are something that we can provide some clarity on either the information that we've shared or the process that we're embarking upon. If there are any one-off specific questions about maybe a situation that you've run into or a question that you have about either you personally, a group you represent, we'd love to connect with you offline just to make sure that you can get that information. And then just to frame the outreach opportunities, this as our virtual meeting is really our kickoff. This is the first of 4 opportunities overall for this first of what we'd anticipate being 3 rounds over the next year. I'll outline that process, but we have our virtual meeting today on the 22nd at noon. Tonight at the History Museum at 6, we will have our first in-person meeting. And then we have a meeting down in South Central Tempe at the Kiwanis Recreation Center on Monday, October 27th, excuse me. And then we'll have our final 4th meeting, but our 3rd public meeting, in-person meeting, will be on Tuesday, November 4th at the North Tempe Multi-Gen Center. So the hope is whether virtual or one of the 3 in-person options, you have an opportunity to hear about what we're looking to accomplish, get some baseline information, understand the process, and know where you can go to stay connected and also to provide some input. And then again, we are anticipating this being kind of a 3-round process over the next year where we'll come back at different points with updated information, soliciting some feedback from there. So I'm going to take myself off of video. Feel free to do the same if you're sharing your video. I'm going to share a presentation. Just want to make sure I don't have any bandwidth issues as I'm sharing, but I will run through the presentation. It'll probably take about 15 minutes or so. And then if you have questions on specific slides, I apologize. I don't have slide numbers on the slides. I've recognized that and I'll make that correction for our meeting for tonight. But if you could give me 1 minute, I'll share the presentation and then kind of kick it off from there. Shauna, just confirming it's coming through?
Yes, you're all set.
Perfect. So we're here, as previously mentioned, to talk through special events and parks ordinance. We'll dive in a bit more on what that means, but we're going to be headed first, really want to outline what we're hoping to accomplish in this larger effort and why we are embarking upon this process. Second, we're going to talk through what we are going to be talking about and covering, and then also what we're not going to be talking about as part of this process. We'd love to provide some context about special events in Tempe, provide an overview of the 2 codes that I mentioned during my brief intro on the Section 5.2 or Special Events Code, as well the Chapter 23 Parks and Recreation Code. So a very brief overview of those. We'd love to touch on some high-level takeaways and some things that we heard this past summer tied to the two public hearings for the council meetings. It may not capture everything and all of the comments. There are a significant amount of comments, but some general themes. We'll provide an overview of some of the questions that we're asking on the survey that is currently live. And then again, would love to just touch on what this 3-round process is going to look like, and a timeline as we start this process. So we've got a goal of what we'd like to accomplish, and then also a time frame of when we would like to accomplish that goal. So first, what are we hoping to accomplish? Well, first, we want to update the 2 codes that I mentioned with community input. We're going to utilize the July 2025 proposed version. Those are kind of the 4 words that we're going to use as a starting point. That code, that version has been rescinded. We cannot use it in its current format. But because information is out there about that, some staff time has gone into that, we believe that that is a good starting place. We also believe that there are some comments that we're going to receive based on what we'd hope to accomplish with that version. So we're going to start with that, knowing we cannot reproduce that in its current format. So please don't look at what we're utilizing as the July 2025 proposed version as something that we're looking at getting a stamp of approval and moving through with. We will need to make some changes because that has been rescinded. And then if I could just outline our goals in kind of 3 high level. 1, we want to provide some clarity about what classifies as a special event. Can we provide, second, some flexibility with different event permit types? I'm going to run through the permits that are available currently, and then also what the 2025 version identified. And then where possible, can we provide some simplification for the process or processes, depending on how we tether them together? And those 3 terms, clarity, flexibility, and simplicity, have been some terms and some words that have come up as I've had conversation with folks over the past year and a half surrounding our special events, our 5-2 code specifically. So that's what we're hoping to accomplish. And the reason why we're making the change and we're embarking upon this process is that the code was originally developed in 1967. It has been through some minor changes over the years, but so has Tempe, and so have events within Tempe. And with that, we know that there's a greater demand for use. The current code may not necessarily reflect how spaces are utilized, whether it's public or some private spaces. And we, again, taking it back to some of the goals of what we're hoping to accomplish, we believe that there is an opportunity to provide clarity and flexibility. And again, on that 3rd level, can we simplify some things as well? And we recognize when we add additional elements, it may not feel like we're simplifying things, but how can we do so, understanding that code is really an important piece so that everybody understands what's expected. What we are here to talk about is for today's public meeting, and I would anticipate would continue forward. I'm going to go back 1. We're here to talk about the 5-2 or the special events code. And we're also here to talk about related elements of the Chapter 23 code as it relates to permits specifically. We're also here to touch on some of the community feedback that we've received so far that we would like to build upon and maybe even flesh out at a greater level of detail through our survey instrument. And then we want to communicate ways that you can be informed, provide input, and then get others involved in this process if you happen to know some folks that can't make some of these meetings. We have various opportunities and ways that have already kicked off to let people know that we're embarking upon this process, but we'd like everybody to stay connected and engage at a level that they feel most suited for them. And as much as we're talking about these 3 things, there are also some elements that we're not here to discuss. We're not here to discuss what has happened in the past on the previous effort that led to the council meetings in July. We're also not here to talk about specific individual permit questions, disputes, or enforcement cases. We'd love to have those conversations offline if you've got them. We just don't want to utilize the public meetings for the context to do that. And then finally, while we're not here to talk about very specific things, we also don't want to zoom out too far and talk about broader topics that are unrelated to special events or park permits specifically. So the hope is that we'll be able to focus on moving forward and some elements between, kind of a big middle area that we can focus so we can actually provide some meaningful updates and improvements to the special events, and then where possible, the Chapter 23 Parks and Recreation Code. With that, just a brief overview of special events in Tempe. Special events provide a significant amount of benefit. It's at the heart of who we are a lot of times within Tempe, where special events help strengthen who we are with our identity, provides a buzz within our community, and also helps support much of our local economy, whether it's through local small businesses, supporting nonprofits. There just is multiple different reasons why special events actually do bring a positive impact to the city of Tempe and even to the region for that matter. Event types, just a few different event types. This is not meant to be an exhaustive list. We have athletic events. We have Ironman Arizona that's coming up for the last time here in a couple weeks. Community events, cultural events, and festivals. We just had the Oktoberfest. We also have different seasonal events like a boat parade that we host. And then there are other special events as well. And events also, we think mostly of them on public property, but if there's a deviation of use of private property, if we have specific uses in private property and there's a change to that use, like a parking lot, for example, then special events are the process that we go through. But within public and private properties, we have parks, streets, parking lots, plazas, just to name a few of the different spaces that we host events. And then overall, just to use a very general kind of numbers, the city hosts over 200 events a year, 600 different event days, so multiple different events sometimes occurring on the same day in different locations, and that we estimate we have well over 1 million attendees for the different events that are hosted within the city of Tempe. And this is, again, public and private property are the locations that we host special events. And we utilize then a special events code. It's not too lengthy. The Parks and Recreation Chapter 23 code certainly has more length to it, but the code really helps to ensure that events are safe, organized, and respectful. It really outlines the pathway to ensure that those things happen. And as we need to provide clarity, additional options, and simplicity, we make some changes to code, but we are going to go through this process to do that. But the code, if I was to take it to a different level, it identifies when a permit is required on public and private property. There are different requirements for that. And then just as a few different pieces of the code, it identifies timelines, when you must or shall or should submit applications, some stipulations, and et cetera, that's included within the special events code. So only a few pages in comparison to the Parks and Recreation Code is much more broad. It includes certainly park spaces, and it supports community access, enjoyment while maintaining safety in our parks, our preserves, for our boating program, recreation areas. It outlines rules and options for using and utilizing spaces. There is code language focused on permits. It also identifies park hours, prohibited activities, and other conduct for safe shared use within our parks and recreational spaces specifically. So whether special events code is both public and private spaces, and it relates to that, our Parks and Recreation Code is very specific to parks and recreation spaces within the city of Tempe. Now I'd just like to touch on the version, again, that we cannot reproduce in its current format, but we are going to reference and seek input on some of the updates that were included in the 2025 version. Again, I'm sharing information here so that we can gather meaningful input. I'm going to point everybody to that survey process. If you have questions, please note them. I'd love to answer them as part of this first virtual meeting. But first, we've actually included some definitions, though we identified what permit requirements were before based on specific activities and gatherings. There weren't any definitions. So in that July 2025 proposed version, there were definitions that attempted to answer what some of those terms are within the code itself. Again, it identifies permit requirements and the application process. Our 2025 version changed some language on timelines. It was a very strict you must or you shall submit an application 60 days before an event. It was loosened to it should. The hope would be that we'd have as much time as possible to be able to ensure that event would be safe and meets the community's needs. And then within the July 2025 proposed updates, we did memorialize protection of spontaneous free speech events. That is something that we were supporting anyways. We actually just memorialized it within the code. I know there were some concerns around that specifically, but the hope was actually to identify that in an updated code, to identify who somebody should contact in the event that there wasn't enough time, especially with like a 60-day window that is required. So as things come up, as a protest, there's an opportunity for us to memorialize protection of spontaneous free speech, but it does require some notification so we can actually work through to determine the complexity of it and how we can ensure that that would be safe. And then just a couple others. Event requirements, we provided some clarifications on safety, cleanup, insurance, the respecting of public spaces. We added additional language around enforcement and appeals for what that should look like. Again, tried to provide additional levels of clarity. And then finally, we added different permit options within our 5.2 special event section 5.2 code that referenced our chapter 23 code. So not everything would have to run through special events, but the hope would be that we would then be able to provide additional permit options depending on, for lack of a better term, the complexity of an event or very specific elements. I'm sure there's some things that I have not touched on here. I think within some of the clarity and definitions, we did identify threshold, which was not included within previous language. So first want to just outline, we are currently operating under kind of two permitting options currently. Since the July 2025 proposed version is not in effect, it was rescinded. We are now utilizing the previous special event permit option, but we also have our park and ramada reservations as a permitting option for us currently, which is for individuals and groups that want to really utilize spaces that aren't available or may not be available on a first come, first served basis. We have limited areas of those throughout our park system. Not every space, ramada, field, court is reservable. So that is kind of one of the limits of our existing approach that we're trying to provide additional flexibility and options for. We also, within our special event permitting process, currently it's typically, and I'll use that term not to mean that every event is large, more complex with infrastructure, amplified sound, alcohol, and vendors. There are some events that absolutely use that, but you can also qualify as a special event if you're charging for admission, for instance. You could have something that is relatively small, but because you're charging for admission, it would classify as a special event. And there's some other terms within the current code that identify what some of those items are specifically. So these are the current existing permitting options that we have. One in Parks and Recreation, the Park and Ramada reservations process, and the second is the special event permit process, which is covered under section 5-2. And some of the proposed additions, just trying to provide some clarity of what's in there. Again, we're using this as a reference point, and we're seeking feedback on that, on what may have been something that some folks liked, and maybe some things that we could certainly improve moving forward. We're not going to be utilizing that version. We cannot. But here are some of the additions that we had within that July 2025 proposed version. We included a limited park use permit. So with the threshold of 30 people identified in the special events code, there was language in the 5-2 special events code shortly after that that did provide some flexibility for some permits within Parks and Recreation. Basically, the limited park use permit, smaller gatherings, but it provides exclusive use of park spaces that may not have been available to reserve previously. So that was one of the upsides to that limited park use permit. Second, we have the neighborhood park activation permit. This is for registered neighborhood groups. How do we activate neighborhood parks through their neighborhood specifically? And then we identified kind of a third tier of a group meetup notification where a group would meet in a specific area and then would move through areas, walks, runs, rides that wouldn't classify as special events. This notification process ensures that we had, or at least was proposed to ensure that we had communication, so that we could then dialogue. What are some of the impacts potentially to the area? Has it grown? Has it maybe migrated into the special events category? But these are 3 permitting options that were proposed. They are not currently available, but they were proposed, and we certainly would love some feedback on are these good options that we should consider moving forward with in the future. Again, being very general on some of the things that we heard this summer, and I hope that we're here addressing some of these items, not in what we're proposing, but on what we're seeking feedback on. First, just the process itself, moving forward in the next year, identifying multiple different touch points. And then within those touch points, we have 4 public meetings for this first round. That we know that there was some concerns and frustration over the overall process and lack of public input. We know that there were some questions and concerns about a 30-person threshold. We would love to understand whether it's a concern about a threshold at all, or whether 30 people seem to be the wrong threshold, but we know that there were concerns about that. Impact on constitutional rights, as well as mutual aid and service groups, potential financial barriers and equity and access, and ultimately, how is it that we can preserve community-based use? Again, there was a lot of feedback received, especially in some of the council meetings and some other communication. This is not meant to be representative of everything. These were just some common themes that we had heard throughout that process. So I've referenced the survey a couple times. It is currently live. It is not an exhaustive and extensive survey. It's not going to take you an hour to fill out. There really are 3 things that we're hoping to gather from the survey. We want to hear about how you utilize and what your experience is with special events and park permits. How do you utilize spaces? How do you attend events? What did you think about specific elements that we had referenced previously from the July 2025 proposed change version? We'd love to hear, did you like them? Did you not? And then what could we overall, how could we make this a better code, with some open-ended question at the end of just seeking additional ideas that you may have for us together to improve the code moving forward. Again, just understanding this is the first touch point of what we anticipate being 3 over the next year or so. All right, so where are we now and where are we headed? We're in the fall of 2025. What we've identified is really that first round of public and stakeholder input. We have today, this virtual meeting is the first of 4 that we have planned. Over the next couple of weeks, we'd anticipate also connecting with some key stakeholders separately, connecting with some boards and commissions to have some conversations as well. Then we will evaluate the input and feedback that we have received. And then late winter, early spring, we would anticipate having a very similar round, where we'd come back with some updates, an updated version of the code, and see what everybody thought about it. We've identified that as our second touch point. And then as we get closer and closer to a final version in the summer, we call it late spring, early summer, before we hit the end of kind of the end of the fiscal year, sometime before the end of June, the hope would be that we would also hold our 3rd public and stakeholder input sessions, and also hold a council work study session, so that we have multiple different avenues at that point that would lead us to finalize the ordinance. And then we would anticipate at some point about a year from now, we would then have a couple more public hearings as City Council would consider possible adoption of an updated and improved city code related to 5-2, which is special events, and then not a comprehensive rewriting of a Parks and Recreation code, but very specific as it relates to some of those 5-2 permitting options and some other ancillary improvements that may be related to that. So ways that we can stay connected and you can provide input. 1, please take time to fill out the survey, register at tempe.gov/forum, fill out the survey. It shouldn't hopefully take too long. But we want you to provide feedback through that. We want to make sure that we're able to capture over the next month some feedback. In a public meeting, please sign in for email updates. That is the best way, is you sign into those meetings and we've got your information. We'll make sure we add you to the list so that you can receive future notifications. If you do a web search for Tempe special events and park ordinances, we have a web page that is up that will include this presentation, which will be recorded, a PowerPoint or a PDF version of what I am sharing. And then there will be also the codes that we're operating under in Chapter 5, Section 5-2 for special events, as well as our our Chapter 23 Parks and Recreation Code, and then some of the versions like the proposed 2025 version that we're referencing as well, and we're seeking some input on. Follow us on social media, share information with your neighborhood or with folks that you believe would like to provide some input and be updated, and then certainly attend future meetings. The hope would be for this virtual meeting that we would have a very similar meeting tonight in person. I'll be sharing the exact same slide deck at that point. But the hope is that each round we can just maybe build on the momentum that we've had from a previous round and make some refinements, and then together really work on updating and improving the 5-2 code and then any connected Chapter 23 code opportunities. So with that, I'll unshare my screen, go back on video, and would be happy to answer any questions. And then if there are specific questions related to a slide, I apologize that I don't have slide numbers on there. We'll get that sorted. But if you remember the title of it, I'll be happy to bring it back up and speak to it specifically.
Okay, Craig, so we do have a question in the chat that I'm going to read for you, and then we have a hand raised and then another in the chat. So, and again, feel free to either raise your hand or put them in the chat, and we'll get to you in the order that you guys have done so. So the first one says, Tempe has been criticized for coming into this process with a solution ready to pass regardless of community feedback. Isn't using the ordinance that Tempe residents shot down in a citywide effort referendum as a starting point evidence that Tempe is not ready to listen?
I appreciate that comment, and maybe we can dialogue offline about that specifically. We're looking at improving the code that we've currently got. We recognize we cannot reproduce that. I certainly understand that perception, but because it does include some elements and ways that we would approach that, the hope would be to utilize this. The goal is we literally cannot go from that, but I certainly understand your concern that we're utilizing this as a starting point. But it does have key elements that we believe contextually and conceptually that we could potentially pull forward, the idea of definitions and those sorts of things, rather than utilizing those exact words.
Okay, and then Bobby, you had your hand raised. If you want to come off mute and ask your
Yes.
question.
Yeah, Bobby Nichols. First, I wanted to thank everybody who worked with the Sharing Food is Not a Crime Coalition, Phoenix DSA, AANHBI, United Campus Workers, all those different groups for gathering 5,000 signatures to reject the July version of this ordinance. And I want to make very clear that I do not agree with using the July version of this ordinance as a starting point. It included too many poison pills to be considered as a reasonable backdrop for the decisions that are being made now. And trying to go through that line by line is going to be about as difficult as going through the current ordinance, the current code line by line, which I think would be a much more useful and worthwhile process. I think it's important that we are, again, I'm glad the city is noticing and admitting that there is a need to protect mutual aid and community events. I'm also glad that the city is willing to admit that there was not a significant number of public input opportunities on this going forward. And I would say that using the July ordinance does sort of make me feel like there is an attempt to just kind of push this through with a little bit more dressing of community input around it. So I would ask, what specifically from the July ordinance does the city think is worthwhile in keeping, and what is the city in these initial stages acknowledging that needs to get rid of? Without sort of getting into the specifics, because obviously the 30-person threshold creates a constitutional barrier. The failure to mention mutual aid in the ordinance itself creates a barrier to those service groups. There's a bunch of issues with the July ordinance, and trying to go back to that one just puts us back at square one rather than what should be happening, which is the city going back to the drawing board and figuring out something that makes it easier to express our constitutional rights in Tempe, and that includes the constitutional First Amendment right to provide mutual aid to people, as has been established by federal courts, and also the right to just gather and have events, an assembly of whatever we want. There are neighborhood groups right now that are struggling to get their Halloween things planned out because of the fee structures that have been put in place. So I'll give my time back over, but I am disappointed to see that the July ordinance version is still being used here.
Bobby, thank you for that feedback. I really appreciate it. And I think the question that I heard in there, and I certainly understand the concern. First, not being able to use that current version, but also it being the one that we know that folks have very specific feedback about, seemed to be a good starting place. Maybe we've missed the mark with that, and I certainly appreciate your feedback with that. I think taking things up a level, looking at some of the concepts, as you know, some of the code language and specifics is very important to work out those details. But as we look at some of we literally can't reproduce it in its current form, but are there some concepts that we want to reconsider as a community that could provide additional clarity? The idea of definitions. Second, can we provide some additional flexibility with some different options? And then how do we look at processes specifically? So within that, rather than starting over with some, coming with nothing, that was a call that we made, and I certainly understand that frustration, the perception of it. But the goal really is we cannot utilize that current version. And then on the flip side, are there some concepts? One, how do you feel about some of the concepts like the definitions? And then second, are there some elements within that conceptually that we could build build upon, whatever the operative term would be for that? So thank you for your question, your feedback.
Okay, and the next question, which I think you covered in a slide, was just asking about a conclusive end date for the process, which you had shared is about a year from now.
Yeah, and we want to make sure that we take time. We've just outlined a path. We've outlined even a seasonal path with that. If it takes us a little bit longer to go through that to get it right, we want to make sure that we do it. But we're just at the beginning, at least trying to frame what we believe that process should look like.
Okay, and then the next question, and then we'll get to some hands, was asking about outreach the department is doing with HOAs. And so Susan, if there's something specific you'd like to see, let us know. But HOAs are, if they're registered with the city, or on our distribution list for all of the information, or invited to attend public meetings. And then we'll also be out at some of the GAIN events, I know, with some of that same flyers and information on how they can participate. Craig, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, or we'll.
I think you covered it, and Sean is a great partner, Susan. So we appreciate the work that Sean and team do in making sure that our neighborhoods are aware. And with that, we got some signs that are posted within parks as well, so that whether it's digitally staying connected or even in person, folks know that we're embarking upon this effort.
Okay, David, we've got your hand next. If you want to go ahead and unmute David Sokolowski. Sorry, I see there's another Dave, but David was first.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah,
Yep.
we can.
Yeah, so I have a question and then I have sort of like a comment. It does kind of concern me that when we went through the public process, it seems like the city has this problem with validating the concerns of residents. I know that one of the issues that I brought up was the fact of having fees. And I was basically told that, like we've had these fees for decades. It's only $8 to reserve a ramada. And from my perspective, that's kind of missing the point. It's that I don't want to charge for public spaces. It doesn't matter to me if it's $8 for a ramada or if it's a larger event. These are public spaces. They're paid for with tax dollars. And you explained how all these community events are beneficial to the city and how they bring residents and they activate public spaces. So from my perspective, I think if we remove the fees, that makes it easier to have those events. It makes it easier to activate park spaces and to bring tourists into the city. So really my question is just that basic concept is, can we provide events for free without charging people to reserve a ramada or to reserve a room at the Pyle Center or at Escalante Center or to reserve a park space? I just want no fees.
Thank you for your comment, David. I appreciate your perspective on that. That certainly is multi-layered just based on spanning events to reservations size. We have different fees for resident, non-residents, different fee structure for special events and reservations. I think there would be certain, specifically some concerns with how that impacts our ability to provide some of the services that we do. And I know it helps support different programs within the city, as well as supporting our parks and recreation spaces and our facilities as well. So certainly there's a lot within that. I just wouldn't anticipate that going completely feeless for a wide range of elements would have probably significant financial impacts that would have to be gauged if we're ever going to consider that. But I do appreciate that comment and the question.
So is that information we can get at a future meeting? What is the financial impact? So, as a public, we need to be able to make that decision, right?
We can certainly put that on our list for future meetings and discuss that internally. But I mean, when you consider use of city facilities for different activities, different rooms, commercial, non-commercial, and trying to identify what some of the programmatic impacts would be of not charging fees for certain things. I'm sure that we can provide those numbers. I'll have to connect with the team to see how we're going to work through that specifically.
Yeah, I don't think waiving an $8 fee would bankrupt the city, but my next topic was about the this word spontaneous, where we talk about spontaneous events. And a lot of times these events are not spontaneous. If it's a protest, it usually takes a lot of planning. Even if you want to have a sports game, you have to have the team and the family and everyone there. So I would really like to understand, like, how do we clarify what is spontaneous, and how do we, if I want to plan a protest, it's probably not going to be spontaneous. I'm going to be calling my friends. I'm going to be saying we're going to meet up the Friday. So how is the city going to handle that?
Yeah, thanks for that follow-up question. And I think this kind of dovetails with Bobby's concern and maybe his question related to utilizing the proposed 2025 version that we can't pull forward, which we won't pull forward, is including that as a place to solicit initial feedback provides opportunities for us to answer and figure out answers to those specific questions. I know that the gist of what that's hoping to accomplish is as much time as we have. If it's not going to be able to run through a special event process, we can work with organizations as an organization to ensure that it can occur and that it occurs safely. So obviously, as much time as we can get for those spontaneous events like a protest, public safety is really going to have to be aware, just so that they can make sure that where it's happening, it doesn't impact traffic or some other public health and safety concerns. So potentially a wraparound reason why starting with that proposed version, at least the element itself of memorializing that has at least brought forward the opportunity to potentially provide additional clarification on that, which is something that sounds like it's needed. The memorialization of what those specific activities are and what some of those timelines are.
Thank you.
Okay, we had another hand that was raised next, and then we'll get to the questions in the chat. So Dave, if you want to go ahead and come off mute.
Sure. Yeah. Hi, Craig.
Dave.
So, yeah, my concern is in part related to using the rescinded ordinance, because my understanding is that ordinance was developed by the city attorney without any public input and without probably a lot of city input, direct city input. So I think it's going to preclude the kind of open process, or it's going to interfere with the kind of open process that you want. What I would recommend is you think more about certain conceptual ideas that might be in that thing, but also but would free us from the language and the complexity of it. So like, for instance, you have reservations versus permits, right? So you have a number of things that can be reserved. And then, and so talking about what do we want to have permits for versus what do you want to have reservations for? Are certain parks more appropriate for certain kinds of activities than other kinds of other parks? And all the the different kinds of events, and the threshold issues that you have, and the threshold issues might vary a little bit by park, even possibly, because the parks have different infrastructure. So I mean, so I think, perhaps having some a little bit more open conversations, and those are just sort of suggestive things, if you could think of other things, but I think having more along those more focused lines, and not getting too tied down to that prior ordinance would be helpful.
Thanks, Dave. I appreciate that comment, and trying to figure out where we end up in round two. The hope is in round one, just getting some feedback on what was proposed. Maybe using the term as a starting point is maybe the wrong term for us. But we've heard some input, we've received some input and some public comments with that. How is it then that we then do move forward, especially in round two, with that input? And I think you touch on just the complexity of trying to manage. And I'm just going to stick up park spaces, public spaces that typically host events and activities, and how they can vary from space to space. They're in different locations. Activities in those spaces may be different just based on what the infrastructure is, or maybe even where it's located. Just the complexity of it, and just the challenge of having a code that really does help provide guidance and expectations, reasonable expectations of how we can ensure that spaces are managed well. So with that, I appreciate your comment. Also would be happy to engage offline to talk through this with folks who are interested. Dave, I'll certainly extend that offer to you if you'd like, and other folks that are there, just on ways that we can solicit your input so that we can look at making some improvements to the code. But thank you.
Okay, Craig, the next few questions will come from the chat, and then Dom will get to you after we get these in order. Is there guidance given a special event on bathrooms and other? And for private property, can you repeat or say what are concerns regarding use?
Yeah, I think what you're touching on with the restrooms is maybe some of the stipulations that's included. Our current code, and even what we're kind of using again as seeking feedback on the proposed 2025 version, is that there are some stipulations identified within city code for different services, whether it's security, traffic control, restroom, sanitation, those sorts of facilities. So those are some stipulations that are already in the code, and currently exist within code. And then second to that, Shauna, there was specific to private property. Would you mind repeating that question, please?
Yeah, and it says for private property, can you repeat or say what are concerns regarding use?
So it's not concerns regarding use, it's just what would classify as a special event. There are specific land use designations as identified for different sites. And if there's a deviation of land use for that specific site, then a special event is required to host that activity. So probably the easiest one is if you hold a concert in a parking lot somewhere. A parking lot has very specific uses. I would venture to guess that a concert would not be one of those specifically without having to go through some change in use. The special event process really is geared towards temporary activities, not something then that would be a change in that land use and its designation moving forward.
Okay, so next question, and for those of you who have put comments in the chat, if there's not a question on it, we're going to get the questions answered, because then that chat will be available. So one of my concerns about the version passed in July was the unchecked authority given to the city manager to decide which events would get approval from the city and how long the city could drag their feet on issuing permits. How will those issues be addressed moving forward?
Yeah, I think very generally, to answer the question focused on our current and existing city code, is the city manager language is already included within that code. And usually it's delegated authority that happens from there, and the assignment of, down to the task force to make decisions on special events and how we can coordinate and shepherd people through that process specifically. So that's kind of the mechanism that exists within there. I certainly understand some of the concerns about timelines, the hope, and just something, again, that we currently aren't operating under this, but the proposed code that we're not utilizing, that we're seeking some input on, did have some softening of the language. The current code states that somebody shall apply within 60 days. We did soften that to where we should apply within 60 days. So the hope would be, again, we want, as if something qualifies as a special event, which run the gamut from very complex to maybe not, we would hope to have, we need by code 60 days to coordinate that process. The hope would be that, and sometimes you need even more than 60 days for something that's even more complex. But with that, some of the proposed changes, again, that we're just seeking feedback on, we're not moving that forward as is this, the softening of that language actually help, where it's not you have to, you shall within that code. And again, we're talking, I don't want to say hyper legal language within city code, but it is legal language. And then we're talking conceptually about timelines here. So we certainly understand that comment. I know we're getting about 15 minutes out, Sean. You're muted.
Thank you. Was making sure there weren't random noises when you're answering. So is the assumption that city-sponsored events trump community events?
I don't have an answer to that. I mean, we support events, whether it's city hosted events, we go through that process ourselves.
Okay, Dom, you're going to be next, and then we'll get to the next questions in the chat.
Hello, can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, we can. Thanks.
Cool. So I'm Dom. I am a Tempe resident. And one of my main concerns that I brought up during the meetings was sort of the First Amendment problems. And I want to be extremely clear here with the rights that are guaranteed by the US Constitution and further enshrined in the Arizona Constitution. Any requirements and or requests and or punishments put on anybody for exercising the First Amendment rights will actually be a violation of the Arizona Constitution. So I am all for memorializing that as an exception to the rule, but anything further than that is going to go wayward of our own Arizona Constitution. So I just want to be super, super clear on that. So thank you.
Thank you, Dom. I appreciate that comment.
Okay, next question. And Ron, if you want to clarify, because I know this was probably in response to something we were talking about earlier, but it asks, why not keep it open-ended? Let the residents bring forward the next step. So that might be referring to the questions we're asking our process.
Yeah, and I can maybe just kind of take an initial kind of answer, and then Ron certainly follow up if you've got any follow-up questions on it. But I think, and again, this is just the path that we chose to take, is that there was information that was included within that. And within that, we added some additional language within definitions as a starting place, rather than, hey, definitions would be great, let's figure out what those are. It just ended up being, we believed as staff, a good starting place within that. If we've missed the mark, we certainly understand that. I've heard the concerns that have been identified within that specifically. But the goal would be, since there was some additional information and options that were provided within flexibility and some clarity, it seemed like maybe a more robust opportunity to gather specific feedback, rather than starting with what we currently have and having some ideas that may just kind of recirculate some of the things that we had within that July 2025 version. So I certainly understand that.
Okay, and then yes, Craig, it was related to the rescinded proposal not being used.
Thank you.
Next question. As I understand the current ordinance, a separate permit must be filed for activities that occur daily or weekly, i.e. each event must be filed on and approved. If I hold a week-long event, am I required to file for a permit for each day of the week?
Yeah, and I'll maybe pitch it over to Sean on this one, but I believe we do have some flexibility depending on what those gaps are between those events specifically. We can work through, well, I guess for lack of a better term, a series of events that have a reasonable time frame associated with them. And I know we've done that. I know that we would consider that. But if Sean, if there's anything that you'd want to add on that, would be happy to pitch it over to you.
Thanks, Craig. You're correct. We can issue a series worth of events on a single permit. For example, a week-long event is one permit. We just recognize what the event logistics are. and the setup during that time. If it's a series of events, as you would refer, that maybe not be daily, as long as there are some stipulations to that as far as site setup and those things don't change, we can work with our task force on that as well too, as far as having that issued through one permit.
Great, thank you. That's Sean Wagner from our Recreation Division. Thank you, Sean.
Okay, and then the next question is asking if there's a single definition of parking lot.
I don't know that it's included within the 5-2 special events code. Maybe it's more in the development code that we have specifically, and I was just using that as a very kind of general reference within that. So certainly, I'm sure there is within city code a definition of that space, as well as there are other land use designations. I just don't have that information in front of me, but I appreciate that question.
Okay, and then this is a follow-up to the previous about denying permits without defined reasons. And so the question gets to, I can imagine a world where the city might have a conflict with a specific community member and it could impact their ability to get permits. Can we add language that better defines what the city must approve?
Thank you. Appreciate that comment. And I would just ask, along with the other comments that have been made, that you would include that within our survey specifically. So again, within the version that we've identified just to gather some input from, some feedback from, there was additional information related to us not issuing a permit for somebody specifically. But would absolutely welcome your feedback there. Thank you.
And as Craig mentioned, within the survey, yes, it does ask for ideas. So any ideas you have to update, that's where it'd be great to include that specific, what you feel should be included. Okay, Bobby's hand was next, and then we'll get back to questions in the chat.
Hi, Bobby.
Hello again. It's Bobby Nichols one more time. I was thinking about all this. I'm just, again, still concerned that we're using this July version, and I wanted to suggest that everybody go and do the survey. And I wanted to ask, in that survey, do we have like specific questions on each proposed change that was made to the current code in the July version, or would it be more along the lines of saying, I sort of wholeheartedly reject the July version along with the 5,000 people who signed the petition in that referendum? Or is it going to be a sort of line by line, pick out this one, I don't agree with that, pick out this next one, I don't agree with that? Just want to like make sure that we're able to give the most comprehensive input, since even though we're saying that we're not able to move forward with this, we're clearly moving forward with it in some way, which is really troubling. So I just want to make sure that there's an opportunity on the survey for people to say, we absolutely need to go back to the drawing board on this and reject the entire July version.
Great. That is, as Shauna mentioned, there is additional opportunities to provide input on how to make this better. We're actually operating kind of in between the two polls that you had mentioned, not very general, but not very specific on line by line as well. So it's kind of a middle point on some of those concepts that were identified. But understand your comment and thank you again and your concern.
So the next question that I have in the chat, and then we'll come back to you, David, is weekly events have been shut down on the basis that they utilize park space that could be used by others, even when those parks are underutilized or empty. So what are the qualifications that would lead to an approval for weekly events?
That's what we're here to find out as part of this updating of the city code. We've got very specific language that doesn't include definitions in the current code of activities that do qualify for special events. So how is it that we can, work together as a community to identify and answer that question specifically at multiple different levels?
Okay, David, did you want to come off mute? Oh, go ahead, Craig.
I could also say, with questions and those concerns, we welcome suggestions related to that within the public survey, specifically of how we could do that. So we're seeking feedback and ideas that you would have. If you've got an idea of how we could do that, please provide that feedback.
Okay, David.
Yeah, I wanted to ask for clarification about this park activation permit because it talks about registered neighborhood groups. And I assume that that was like neighborhood associations and homeowners associations. But for someone like me, I don't have any of that because the way that they drew the map, they excluded my property so that I wouldn't be included in the neighborhood association. So I'm not allowed to vote or do anything like that. So I'm trying to understand how would someone like me, like if I wanted to register a neighborhood group or if I wanted to use a park activation permit, how would that be accessible to someone like me?
Shauna, my assumption is we would work together and just work with David specifically and try to find out what some of those barriers are and just have a discussion about that.
And
You're
David, I
correct.
think to Craig's earlier comments, that doesn't exist. So if you have a comment on how to make that better, if you think it should be open, then yeah, absolutely, put that in the feedback. And then that could be looked at. Sean, did you want to add anything to that?
I just wanted to add in that Craig was correct, and David, just specifically, while not in play now, that was a part of the limited park use permit that was proposed as some greater flexibility. Now, granted, love to hear feedback on how that can be tweaked, morphed, or thrown out, and we start with something else. But that was also allowing Tempe residents specifically, not necessarily neighborhood groups, to be able to utilize those parks that currently aren't designated for reservations.
Okay, Craig, did you want to wrap us up then?
Yeah, absolutely. First, thank you, everybody. I appreciate the hour that you have taken. Appreciate the engagement, the comments, as well as the questions. If more come up, we are having 3 additional public input meetings. Again, first one tonight, 6 p.m. over at the History Museum. Next Monday over at the Kiwanis Rec Center, and then the following Tuesday over at the North Tempe Multi-Gen Center. Both of those are at 6 o'clock. Fill out the survey, visit the webpage, and please stay connected. Let folks know. We really are. I certainly I've heard the comments and concern about the version that we're starting with, but we're hoping to get feedback on that specifically, and that's some feedback that you have. We would definitely hear that. So thank you very much. Appreciate your time. Look forward to connecting with you in the future. Thank you.